You're listening to The Grind. Well-caffeinated conversations with disc golfers who are passionate about improving their games and helping others to do the same. Welcome to episode 7 of The Grind, a disc golf podcast with Josiah and David.
How's it going, guys?
We're going to talk some disc golf. I'm looking forward to this episode. We are going to review the Discraft Anax. We've got a pro tip from Chris Dickerson, and we're going to talk about playing in the wind, driving in the wind specifically, how to do it well, what to look out for, how to beat your buddies. But first, as always, David, I got to ask, and I think you've had a pretty good disc golf week, so what are you sipping on, and how was your week?
Dude, yeah, great disc golf week. Before we get there, we're sipping on some Night Round this is another one of Vanessa Van Dyken's blends with Birdie Fuel. This is, I think, one of her darker roasts. It's a Sumatra called Night Round, and man, it kind of is reminiscent of, I was telling Josiah before the podcast, my brother got his start in coffee working for Pete's Coffee, and it's one of the coffees that I drank early on was their Major Dickinson's blend, and this is pretty reminiscent of that for me. It's just kind of that classic dark roast with some, I am getting some of that tobacco-y taste with some nutty feel going on. I'm not a huge dark roast fan, I think I've talked about in the past, but man, I mean, I'm not offended by it. I think in general, if you're a dark roast fan, this is a great cup.
Yeah, I don't know if I would have said tobacco-y without you saying it, but once you said it, I was like, oh yeah, that definitely is what lingers for sure. It's a good flavor. I'm also not necessarily the biggest dark roast fan generally, but I'm enjoying the cup for sure. Thanks again to Vanessa and Birdie Fuel for sending us the coffee.
Yeah, super rad.
Tell me about your week. It was just a typical week for you.
Yeah, just a typical week. Let's see, last week I think I got one round in because my hip was bugging me, but this week was pretty great. I got quite a few rounds in. My wife and I were actually, we went to Arizona this past weekend. We were supposed to go to watch baseball spring training, but they're still fighting over who gets the most money, billionaires versus millionaires. I'd take the players on that. But man, instead of watching baseball, we got to play a bunch of disc golf. And so we were in Scottsdale, so we got to play 2 rounds at Vista del Camino, which is where they're currently having the memorial this weekend. And randomly, I'm sure some of our listeners saw, next to Vista del Camino, there's the Spinners on the Green disc golf store. It's pretty sweet that it's basically attached to the course. But the Macbeths, Paul and Hannah, were in town signing autographs at Spinners on the Green. So my wife saw that, and we got to go and do a little meet and greet with Paul and Hannah, which is super fun. Shout out to, I'm sure Paul and Hannah both listen to our podcast.
Weekly. They've actually been asking us to do bi-weekly, so they have a little bit more content.
But shout out to them. They both were great. They're great people. Hannah was great with answering some of my wife's questions with just understanding disc weights and trying to figure out as a female player how to grow her game and figure out what's best for what disc she should be throwing. Yeah, shout out to them.
Yeah, that's awesome.
But we ended up getting some autographs. Josiah's going to talk about later on the podcast. We might have something special to give away.
Yeah, but maybe. I might just keep it for myself.
It was pretty fun playing at sea level. I think I've been messing around with trying to get some hyzer flips, and it's a lot easier to get some hyzer flip action at sea level than it is at elevation. So the rounds, I felt pretty good with the rounds there. I mean, I didn't really know the course. It was nice because we found out that the water, I mean, there's plenty of water there. I think there's probably about 4 or 5 holes that are, you're definitely risking throwing in the water. And when you're on vacation, you don't really want to lose a disc in the water because you're probably not getting it back. But the water there's only like 2 feet deep. And so you can definitely walk out to the center, no big deal, and grab your disc.
I didn't know that. That's cool.
Yeah, I was pretty pumped. We saw somebody walking in the middle like, oh, this isn't bad. Which happened. My wife threw one in the water and she went out and got it. No big deal. It was pretty quick.
You're not much of a gentleman, man.
Yeah.
Let her go out.
She didn't want me to go out. My wife is too kind.
Yeah, she's fiercely independent, right?
Yeah. But the rounds are great. I think I shot both rounds probably around -2, -3.
Pretty open course by coverage.
Yeah, fairly open course. Definitely. I mean, a lot of your obstructions are people walking, but people are pretty great out there. I think people know and are aware that it seems like it's a disc golf park. So people are pretty friendly about it. I think here at Watson Island that we play a lot and Riverbend Park, the people are not as friendly about it. It seems like they want to establish that this is not a disc golf park. This is a place for families to walk.
Either that or they have no clue what's going on, even despite many people probably saying like, hey, it's probably not the best place to set up for a photo shoot, or it's not probably the best place to set up for a picnic. This big metal basket in the back of your shot is what people are aiming for with these kind of hard plastic circles.
Yeah. I feel like the thing that I like coming away from this week is I feel like my putting's starting to come back. I was texting Josiah yesterday. I've been practicing a lot of putting in the backyard, and I feel like I'm back at that 20-foot mark, 25-foot mark that I'm cashing most of my putts. And that's really where I want to be going into the tournament this next week. So how about your week?
Man, it was good. I did not meet Paul McBeth. I did not travel to sea level and
Your
play
life sounds
new
like
courses.
it sucks.
I know, right? But I got a few rounds in. The weather has been fantastic again. Today got a little bit windy. It's spitting a little bit rain, but it's been so nice this week. And I was talking about it last episode a little bit, but my game had felt a couple rounds playing Palisades, where we're going to be playing the tournament, and in a week, like it was dropping off a little bit. And last year about this time, I started having a slump, and my game just fell apart. And so I think it was one of those things where I knew how I got out of it, and so I was able to apply those things right away. So for me, it was like, okay, I'm going to get a putter round in. I'm going to go play, our normal course, but play it with just putters. I'm going to disc down to slower discs to just make sure my form is where I want it to be. I'm going to play the little upshot course and work on my short game and my putting. And then I feel like all those things, my drives feel good. And I feel like I don't feel like I'm in perfectly peak form, especially playing in the wind today, which we'll talk about later. Obviously, it exposes, especially swirly wind, it just kind of exposes your game a little bit. But I do feel good about my game, and I'm happy to have gone from a couple rough rounds to, no, I feel good. I think that it's going to be a good tournament, and I'm going to have fun. So
nice. And I also, one thing that I took away from last week, we interviewed our good buddy Ryan Wilking last week. We were asking him about how to drive 500 feet. And one of the things he talked about was he said, David, just throw putters. And so one of the things that I'm trying to
incorporate. Let's just say Josiah says, David, just throw putters. You need to throw putters. You should start
Ignore
putters.
Josiah.
And it's like, I went out with my fast discs again. And then Ryan's just like, had to tell you on the podcast.
I think this was about the 20th time probably I've heard somebody say just throw putters to find that clean release point with your backhand, because it's really going to tell, it's going to exploit your weaknesses or what you're doing wrong. And so I've decided that, I'm going to go out once a week, and I have a field right behind my house, and have that as a discipline once a week. Bring out my bag and I think I have 14 Whizzer putters, and just go out and throw all 14 twice, just to try to make sure I'm working on cleaning up that form and having that clean release point.
Yeah, well, that's going to make our reviews better too, because that Wizard review, when you were turning them all over, like torquing them over, I was like, I don't think it's the disc, but I'm not going to give him a hard time.
Yeah. I'm feeling a little bit better now with my backhand.
Yeah, not that I have an incredible like backhand or a lot of power or anything, but it was one of those things where I was like, I don't think the Wizard's that understable, David. I just think you're throwing them with a rolled wrist.
What's funny is I was trying to do some flip up hyzers with, and they're decently beat in because I putt with them quite a bit. Sure. And they were not flipping up for me. They were holding that hyzer all the way through.
Man, once you clean up your form a little bit, the discs become much more stable.
Oh, yeah.
Because when you get rid of a lot of that oat, the disc, and that's great in the wind because you can throw a slower disc, and as long as you give it a lot of spin, you're going to be good, which we'll talk about throwing in the wind later.
Oh, for sure.
Well, it's time for the How Did You Do That Pro Tip with Chris Dickerson, USDGC and two-time Disc Golf Pro Tour champion. I asked Chris, what's one thing that keeps AMs and lower level open players from leveling up their games? And he said, short and sweet, putting and decision making. And I think this is good. Like, I think that there's so many aspects of, the gap between your average AM or your lower level open player and the big boys. But it's kind of funny. I always think power. We talked last week about how to throw 500 feet. That's just naturally what I think about because that's the skill that's most apparent. But last week, Ryan was saying, hey, not letting your last throw affect your round, and then also not letting a bad throw snowball into like a really big score. And then I think, Chris's thing, putting, yes. I mean, we've had a lot of pros tell us putting is so key, and just confidence putting. And watching Vegas, you just saw Drew Gibson, he had pressure putts on every hole. Gannon Burr did as well, and they both went back and forth, tough putt, tough putt, tough putt. And you just saw Drew kept his confidence, and Gannon, he's 16. He's going to pick it up. He's going to have that confidence later on. But he started to lose it, and the putt started being a little less crisp, and it was just a war of attrition that Drew eventually won. So, I mean, to me, putting is huge. What do you think about on the putting side, David?
Yeah, I really like this in general. I think from an amateur standpoint, I think when we think about what the pros would say, we're looking for, we talked about throwing 500 feet this last week. We're looking for answers like that because we feel like that's what we're missing. But every single, thanks to all the pros out there for all the pro tips that we've been getting in. This is our 7th episode, and we have plenty lined up for episodes to come. But every single pro tip that we're getting coming in, nothing related to distance. And I think this is so approachable because as an amateur, talking about putting and decision making, anybody, any skill level can work on decision making. We can all, a low level amateur and a pro a pro might not be that great there might be one pro that might not be that great at decision making one day. Then there might be a low level intermediate player that it has a great day of decision making. I think it's approachable in the sense that no matter what your skill level is, this is something that we can really fine tune as disc golfers, just really working on. And so it's just an approachable, as opposed to you need to throw 500 feet in order to get to this level. It first starts with this. It starts with the basics. You need to learn how to make wise choices, because I think wise choices are going to lead to, they're going to lead to good form. They're going to lead to, you name it. It's going to lead to being a better disc golfer to begin with, a better foundation. And I think that's really the goal. So I really like where he just hammers that home at the beginning, at the end of the day, and it's just about putting and decision making. And I really like that. That's where we should start.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. And there's no athletic limitation that will affect your putting inside the circle. Obviously if you got some major injury or whatever, but a 7-year-old and a 70-year-old can make 15 footers, and a 7-year-old and a 70-year-old can learn how to make better decisions on the course. And so I do think that's, it's kind of cool. Like, not all of us are going to go pro, not all of us are going to tour, but we can all get better, and it's fun to get better. And we all start at different points and are going to have some limitations that will determine, no matter how much hard work you put in, how far you can go. But like you were saying, so many of these pro tips are easy things to implement if you just put in the time and the focus and the energy.
Yeah. And I like this. I always go back to applying it to life. The same thing in life is we tend to try to overcomplicate things, as opposed to if we can really bring it down to just I think it's going to really translate to being great decision makers, and disc golf is going to translate, hopefully over to in your day-to-day life. It's really that critical thinking and decision making skills that can translate over to making positive choices in our day-to-day life, whether it's what we're eating on a day-to-day basis or whatever it might be. So
yeah, and I think both on the disc golf course and in life, so much of your life is made up by the little decisions. We all think about the big ones, like where am I going to live? Am I going to...
How to throw 500 feet.
Right. Yeah, well, if that was just a decision, I would have made it already. Like, yes, I decide to throw 500 feet. Don't even tell me about the alternatives. I choose yes. Every throw counts the same. And we so often think about, if I could just birdie this one that's right outside of my range, and I'm going to just try to throw like this really big shot and try to get there. But every throw counts the same. And the missed 15 footer and the birdie on the hole on a 60 footer that you normally wouldn't birdie, they count the same. They feel different, but they count the same. And so I totally buy that for sure. And I asked Chris, like, how do you develop that decision-making skill? And he said, which is kind of what I would expect, but he said a lot of trial and error. it's just using percentages to help you make decisions on your shot. And David, I think that you do this better than I do in terms of just weighing the potential for bogey, double bogey, par, birdie, etc., and then making the right choice. You want to talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think in general, my tendency is to latch on to things that people say that I think that are hammer home for me. I think I talked before about Paige Pierce, give it a chance when you're putting. Another thing I've talked about before on the podcast, and I think we talked about on the second cup, but Nate Sexton talks about the pro shot is the highest percentage shot, thinking about your highest percentage of success. And so when you're evaluating that, yeah, you might have an outside shot of birdieing this if you have if you have your 2% incredible drive that you land up, park it by the basket and get it in. But the other outcome of that is you're going to end up OB, and you're more than likely going to end with a bogey or double bogey. I think hands down, especially in a tournament, I'm going to be playing that hole for par, because I know my percentage of getting par on that hole, if I play it safely, is 85 to 90%. And knowing I would take 85 to 90% par over a 2% chance of birdie any day. That just doesn't make any sense, because you're also thinking about the field. In amateur play, a lot of amateurs are going to make that mistake of going for that outside shot at birdie, and they're probably going to be bogeying and double bogeying that hole. And if you can swipe 1 or 2 strokes by getting par, hands down, take that 85 to 90% chance of getting par so you can swipe a stroke from the field. Yeah, so I really like where he jumps back into that. I think it really hammers home that concept that Nate Sexton kind of built into my mind.
I think that the other side of that, to me, is just, as I'm listening to you talk, I'm thinking about, is you have to try some different shots to learn that. Like if you said, hey, my only shot is overstable, flex forehand, and then a putt. That's what I got. You can do really well on a lot of open courses or certain courses with that shot, and you may not develop the other shots because so I do think that you have to, decide what's my goal for the day. Like, hey, if my goal is having the most fun, then I got to determine what gives me fun. Is it fun to, you got to determine what gives you fun. But if you're trying to get better, I think you do have to try the shots that right now aren't the highest percentage for you, if they're the highest percentage on the hole, or, that sort of thing. And then the flip side of that too is I think sometimes I have to redefine what fun is for me. And fun sometimes is this hole that I have never birdied before, I finally birdied. I think it's worth trying that. And then sometimes, and especially in the tournament, I want to make what's fun is to play boring disc golf, consistent disc golf, to not let mistakes get to me. That little dumb 30-foot pitch out I got to make and then lay up for my bogey is fun. And I've got to redefine what fun is. And honestly, it's also about like the aggregate fun. Like if you get so mad when you screw up, but you're going for every hardest hole position and shot, then even you make one out of those on 18, but you're overall going to have a bad day. Yeah. So I think it is also the aggregate of your fun, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. I was telling Josiah about around today before coming in, I tried this big Anheuser shot. Anheuser kind of flexed out going down. And
over a grove of trees in a big tailwind into a tiny fairway.
And I landed the shot. Like I'm not the best at Anheisers. I'm really just learning it with the backhand. And the first time trying it, I landed about 380 feet, and I got the perfect placement to pitch it up the middle of the gap on a par 4. And I was stoked about it, but it happened one time in a tournament. There's no way that I would try that shot, but I think having fun in a round, you have to try those shots. But yeah, when it comes to a tournament, I think you're right. It kind of comes down to being okay with playing that boring disc golf, or keeping it simple in your mind so you're not having to overthink or not having to add a bunch of decisions to make. I think that's one thing that I talk about. I've talked about just to Josiah before, but in the sense of like with my marriage, with my wife, my wife is my wife, and I've chosen to be with her, and I've chosen to love her, and that's what I've chosen. So I don't need to think anything otherwise other than that. I think if you have a shot that you're going for and you're committed to that shot, you don't need to think about any other shots. And so I think that's how I kind of keep it simple in my head, because I deal with a lot of anxiety. And I think in order to combat that anxiety, I try to keep things simple in my mind, and I commit to things and just tell myself that this is the decision I made, and I'm not going to let anything change that. And I think that that's partially why I have a hard time in the wind, is because I've made my decision and I don't want to have to remake my decision.
Yeah, no, I feel that for sure.
And so I think that's where maybe my weakness comes into play.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the wind. So I think that generally in the wind, I play worse than I normally play, but I feel like I naturally, like, I think about, I'm pretty good at the analytical side of the wind. I think, oh, it's a tailwind, I want to throw this or that, but I want to get better at it, and I don't want the wind to affect me mentally. So maybe as an intro, you can just talk about your relationship to the wind and how you are changing that relationship.
For sure. I think my initial relationship with the wind in disc golf is, okay, it's windy, let's not play today. I've slowly changed a little bit. We had multiple, I think both years that we've had our friends tournament, we do a craft beer tournament every year with our friends that everybody pitches in a 6-pack, and we distribute the beer based off prizes, and last place gets, I think we do Bud Light, right?
It's a 6-pack of Coors last year.
6-pack of Coors. But we have a lot of fun with that. But both years were crazy wind. I think we were playing about 30 mile an hour winds both years, right? Or 25?
Yeah, I think especially at least one of the courses we would play. We play our three local valley courses, and both years we've had like 20 to 30 at the really open one.
Yeah. So I think those two rounds are when I look back to having to have more of a relationship with the wind in disc golf, I look back to those two rounds because I completely fell apart as a disc golfer and realized that I hated the wind so much to when I do have to play in the wind, I had no concept or ability to even think.
You were just trying to get the round over.
I was just trying to get the round over with. Yeah, I was trying to get there and get out because I hate the feeling of being in the wind. I hate everything about it. And I think, there's something to say. Josiah mentioned earlier with Calvin Heimberg's quote about there is no wind.
I think that was on the second cup last week. So
okay,
just for the listeners, what I think Calvin said, and this is purported because it's secondhand, but was there is no wind. And I think the idea that I brought or took from that was, of course there's wind. Of course you've got to make pre-shot decisions based on the wind, but then you tell yourself there is no wind or you forget the wind. Mm-hmm. And I think that honestly, Calvin's got a lot of power. He throws over stable disc well, etc. But I do think, if I think about people playing the wind well, he's one of them for sure.
Yeah. But I think there's something to say about that in the sense that by him saying that, he's kind of eliminating that as a variable in his head of feeling like it's going to change the outcome of his game. He's still expecting to perform at a high level. I think that's what that communicates.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think for me, when the wind comes, I just expect I'm going to lose 10 strokes. And I think getting there to begin with, I'm already writing my round. I'm already telling myself that I'm not going to compete at a high level. And so I think I've really been working on the past couple of months, really redefining that relationship, what Josiah said, with the wind, as far as just whether it's a tailwind, crosswind, headwind, really trying to understand, okay, what disc do I want to throw? What angle do I want to throw it on? And what's going to give me that highest percentage outcome of success in the wind?
Yeah, so let's talk the technical side a little bit, and then we can get back to the mental side. Yeah. A lot of listeners will, if you live in Kansas, you're probably already way better than us at dealing with the wind. But every spring in Colorado, we get on average 15, I'd say, from basically March through May, and then you get the 20 to 30, and with gusts, and so. A lot of times we don't play as much, especially with David being goal-oriented and wanting to have the best score possible. You already know you're probably not going to get your personal record when it's 30-mile-an-hour wind out there. But let's just start with headwind. And so I think that in general, you want to keep the bottom of the disc out of the wind. And so what that would mean would be in a headwind, you want to avoid throwing nose up. If you throw nose up in a headwind, the disc is going to rise, depending if it's understable or overstable, and just die out left really early or potentially get thrown right. And so what do you typically do in a headwind? Do you throw more stable? Do you throw less power? What's your game plan?
I'm definitely first thinking overstable disc. I'll go to whether it's a shorter shot with a Firebird or a longer shot with a Halo Wraith. That's my first initial thought. Or if I'm thinking backhand, I'll go to just a regular star wraith. But first I'm thinking overstable. Second, I'm thinking about, okay, is the headwind coming in a little bit of a crosswind? Is it coming in a little bit on the left side, a little bit on the right side? Is the forehand going to be better in this headwind? Is the backhand going to be better in this headwind? And so I think trying to figure out first if I want to go backhand or forehand, if both of those are options. And that's really where I start off with. Think first overstable, and then I think about, do I want to go backhand or forehand here? What's going to play better in this headwind?
And do you change anything about your technique or your intended trajectory, if that makes sense? Or you just kind of, you try to do your same throw, but just mostly handle it by disc selection?
I'm more intentional about keeping my disc low. I think if the spike hyzers out of the out is not going to be a decision that I would choose. I want to keep my disc as low as I can. The moment that your disc gets any bit in the air, it just feels like that little, if it gets that little bit exposed to the bottom of the disc, I mean, it's really going to take it and do things with it you do not want your disc to do. And so definitely a goal of mine is it's easier with the forehand for me to keep it low. It's definitely a skill that I'm working on right now to keep it low with my backhand, but that's definitely something that I'm trying to do.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I definitely think more stable, more overstable generally, depending on the shot and the hole. I also think about really having clean form, nose down, low shot. And then I also think about trying to make sure the disc has a lot of spin on it. I try not to think about all these things while I'm throwing, but certainly before the shot, I want to think smooth, clean, nose down, low. And if I do that, I actually think the headwind can sometimes be an advantage. And I think, we'll get back to the mental side, but I do think you can get you'll be surprised how straight you can get a neutral to stable, not even overstable disc to fly in a ripping headwind if you have a lot of clean spin on the disc. And I think my natural tendency is to throw really hard into the headwind to try to beat it. And I think the way you beat a headwind is to have a nice, clean, smooth release, nose down, low. And then, like you're saying, I think we can probably talk about it more on crosswind, but I do then also think about which way do I want the disc to fade and how will that be affected by a crosswind element. But let's go tailwind if that's cool. And you want to do the same thing. You just want to talk about, hey, what's your approach? And I think that's changed a bit for you lately.
Yeah, I mean, tailwind is one that I was telling Josiah early on when I was asking questions about wind early on. One of the answers I got was think overstable in the wind. And I just applied that to wind across the board. I just thought, okay,
that doesn't work in all wind.
I'm going to grab an overstable disc. And in a tailwind, I mean, the tailwind's going to make your disc much more overstable. And so my overstable discs were immediately just becoming massive meat hooks and weren't going anywhere. And it was really frustrating for me. And I do not throw a whole lot of understable discs because I don't throw backhand very often. And that's something, again, that I've been working on. We've talked about it quite a bit on the podcast. And that's one thing that I've realized. We just did a disc review on the Essence last week, and I absolutely fell in love with it as far as I feel like that disc that is helping me find that clean release point and getting some solid hyzer flips with my backhand. And I'm also finding some fun anhyzer shots with it. That's the disc now that I'm chucking in a tailwind. I'm thinking understable now in a tailwind, and it's crazy to me realizing how stable an understable disc can be in a tailwind. I think that was very eye-opening for me as amateur, really learning how the disc flies in the wind. So definitely in the past, I mean, this is in the past month that this has completely changed for me. So
yeah, I think that I totally agree with all that. I think that one thing you have to think about is, the relative velocity of the disc. And so in a headwind, if you release at 50 miles an hour, 60 miles an hour, and you've got, let's just use 50 for the example, and you got a 20 mile an hour headwind, it's like you're throwing 70. Mm-hmm. So you're throwing finally as fast as some of the pros throw. And so you have to expect the disc to perform differently than if you threw at 50. And the opposite is true. So if you're in a 20 mile an hour tailwind and you release at 50, you're throwing like someone who's throwing 30. Now, obviously, the disc is going to travel typically further than it would if you threw 30. But I used to think that the tailwind, I think partially because we're at 4,500 feet elevation typically or higher playing, and so the disc behaving so stable or overstable would actually be harder for me to get distance than in a headwind, which sounds crazy, I know. But I think for me is making sure that, yes, the disc is understable. Also, a slower disc for me performs better because that fade comes in later, so I can get some really good distance with a slower, like a Crave or even a mid-range a lot of times in that tailwind. And then I think the other thing is being willing to potentially put the disc on a little bit more anhyzer than you normally would. I think a lot of times you can get a lot of extra distance by just a touch of anti than you otherwise might. Cool. Well, let's move to Crosswind briefly. I think Crosswind is maybe one of the more challenging. I mean, swirly. I think swirly and quartering winds in general are tough, but I think a Crosswind, to me, the biggest thing is having both the forehand and the backhand, assuming the hole can account for it. Typically, a Crosswind is going to accentuate the turn and the fade of a disc. So if you can imagine, if you throw an understable disc as a backhand right-hand player into a crosswind that is moving from right to left, if you turn it over, the disc actually gets pushed down and is going to end up more right than you'd expect. And if you hyzer it and it never turns over, the wind's going to blow it way left. And so you're going to end up with way more left than you expect. And that's one of the reasons you would maybe have both the forehand and the backhand. And then, so I think a lot of it is, we've talked about a lot, developing the full toolkit, having all the options. But also, I think, just judging, hey, I normally would throw a flat to fade shot here, but I think I can throw a slower disc on a little bit of hyzer and let the wind help me. Or maybe it's, no, I normally would throw a slower disc here, but the wind's going to push it down, and so I need something a little bit more stable to finish out. What do you think about Crosswind?
Yeah, I think that's part of the reason why I wanted to learn how to throw backhand. Earlier on, I was so reliant on forehand that when there were crosswinds, I mean, there's some crosswinds that you try to throw in with your forehand, and it's just going to get knocked down every time if it's coming right at the top of the disc, I guess, coming from, I throw righty forehand, so if it's coming from that left side, pushing it down, it drove me crazy. And naturally, I want to learn how to throw that backhand shot to play it a little bit better. I love crosswinds when it is an open shot because I love being able to put it out a little bit on a hyzer, a little extra wide, and letting the crosswind kind of do the work for me. I feel like I don't have to throw it as hard, and the crosswind kind of picks it up and pushes it to the basket, whether it is a forehand or backhand shot. That's fun for me. I think it gets a little bit more difficult when they're tighter lines. And I mean, crosswinds can be really, really tough to play in when they are those tighter lines.
Yeah, and I think that partially goes back to, just having good decision making on, hey, this line normally is tough, and then I add a huge crosswind element, I may need to play a little bit more conservatively. I think the crosswind can be super fun. I like it for just what you said and using it as an advantage in some ways. And I think it kind of gets to the mental side. We talked about Calvin Heimberg earlier. But, whether it's driving or putting, we'll talk about putting another time, but just seeing the wind as it's another element, but not as a disadvantage. Like there's going to be certain shots that are going to be disadvantaged by the wind. But if you tell yourself, hey, I play well in the wind, I like the wind. And then you say, hey, that crosswind's actually going to let me throw an easier shot. Or, yeah, this shot is tough, but I've thought through it. And part of that is just having that kind of positive thinking that I think for me helps me in the wind is like, hey, I get to throw a different shot than normal, which is fun. And the wind's going to help this shot.
Yeah, I think there's something to say about that. I think going back to, believing that you can do it and using things to your advantage. There was with 13B at Watson today, I played around with my brother, and both John and I walked up to the hole, and I told him, I love this hole when it's that crosswind pushing towards the basket, because you have so much room to put it out wide and let the wind push it to the basket. You don't have to think too much about the shot.
It's just a hyzer, but yeah. You have to throw a little bit tighter if there's no wind.
Yeah.
So the right side's open, and the crosswind, if it will as long as you play it wide, you'll generally park the hole if you just give it a chance. Yeah, I think that's helpful. And we have a windy tournament coming up. I played a bit in the wind today, just a short course. You played Watson, and I think it's certain things, especially that swirly wind, are frustrating. You're not going to necessarily score as well, but I think going back to Calvin Heimberg of not letting it get into your head. and realize that everybody's facing the same wind. And if it's a casual round, we're talking about tournaments a lot because we got one coming up. But if you're just playing with your friends or playing by yourself, it's another thing to learn. It's another thing to get better at. And as long as you're not losing a bunch of discs and you can have fun, then you might as well try.
Yeah, for sure.
Ready to get into a disc review?
Let's do it.
This week we have the Discraft Anax, a 10-speed, 6-glide, 0-turn, and 3-fade control driver. I have been throwing this a bit, and I like it. But, David, I want to hear what you think about it first, because this is the first time you threw it.
Yep, I've seen you throw it a decent amount. I mean, it always looked pretty, so it had me, I guess, envious just by the look of it. But it seemed, I mean, the disc numbers are 10, 6, 0, 3. It seemed for me like too close to in between to the Wraith and the Thunderbird to actually consider having it in my bag. And so I never actually considered even picking one up and throwing it because I didn't want to have that.
Yeah, the overlap.
I didn't want to have that choice of choosing one disc or the other. Man, I really enjoyed it. The grip feel in the hand. The Wraith is a bit, I'd say a decent amount wider with the width. And
yeah, so I think the Anax is a 10-speed from Discraft, but I think the rim is much closer to the Thunderbird. I think it's that 9-speed rim.
It's a little bit thinner of a rim, it feels like. So it actually feels really good in my hand. And I was getting some solid distance out of it. I'd say the distance that I was getting was in between my T-Bird 3 and my Race, so I was probably getting about 340 with it.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
And with some solid stability. And there's quite a few holes that we have at Watson right now that plays really nicely on the backhand. I really enjoyed it, and I think it's exactly, I mean, it's a pretty stable disc with some solid glide. You can put it out on a like flat hyzer, and it definitely will carry out there, and it just has that solid fade at the end, that predictable fade that you can rely on. So I have to say that I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, I like them a lot too. I think that they've been in my bag. I talked about it on the Thunderbird episode, but they've been in my bag for a while. They do have, I don't think the hand feel is quite as comfortable maybe as a Thunderbird. They have a pretty aggressive rim, but they still that rim size it feels really good. I don't think that they have quite the 3 fade. Like I do think that they're more of a 9-speed, maybe not quite the 10. I think that the glide is real. 6 seems like a lot, but I do think they have real glide. I don't think they have turn out of the box, for me at least, at my arm speed, and I think even up a little bit. But I think the 3 fade's maybe a little bit high. I might give it like a 2.5 because it does have a real hard fade, but it's not like throwing something just stupid overstable. You can get a full flight out of it, with a 350-foot arm or. Maybe at sea level, maybe even a little less.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah, it's not coming anywhere close to the Firebird for me as far as fade goes.
Yeah, no. And the one other thing just talking about that, I like that the Anax, it doesn't really seem to have a huge skip. I don't think it's the shape of that bottom rim, but to me, like if you throw like a Wraith and an Anax on a similar shot, the Wraith is going to have a lot more ground play. And I think the Anax for me is that really reliable placement shot. If you land on hyzer, you don't end up with always a massive skip. And so I find it super useful. I'm thinking Watson 15, where you've got this hyzer that needs to finish. There's OB right and left. And if you skip, you're going to be OB left. But you really have to throw that hyzer. I never have it skip OB on me if I give it any room. And so I like that a lot as well.
Yeah, for sure. I was messing around with a little bit with the forehand too. To be honest with you, I never really got a good feel for it forehand. I still want to mess with it a decent amount more just to see what it feels like, because I think it is a disc that I could find some success with. I just think I was messing with both a brand new Anax and then also a beat-in Anax that Josiah let me borrow. Both of them, I think I was having a hard time figuring out that release point that I wanted it on. And so, I'd like to mess with it a little bit more on the forehand.
Yeah, I occasionally will throw it forehand, but I don't love the feel. I think once again that aggressive rim just feels a little funny in my hand. I know a lot of people huck them super well on the forehand, but it's just not that disc for me. I really like a backhand. I will throw it occasionally on the forehand, but I'm probably going to go to a Wraith at that point if I need that shot, or I'm going to back down to something slower like the Resistor. Yeah, I like the flight. I use it primarily for straight to hyzer shots, being like a slightly beat in Onyx for me. I also really like it in the Headwind. One of my longest throws was actually the Onyx in a blistering Headwind, that Friends tournament that we played. I threw like well over 380. The hole was like 390 and I was past it into a blistering Headwind that had a little bit of a left to right crosswind element. And I just kept it nice and low, and I think the wind held it up. And it was like, just dead straight the whole time, and then fell down. So I ended up like 40, maybe 50 feet right of the hole because I expected some fade and the wind didn't let it. But I think it holds up really well in a Headwind for me at my arm speed and our elevation. And so I can trust it to smash on it and know that it is going to fade at the end, or at least not turn over. But I usually use it for really those control shots. I mean, it's called a control driver, but that's really what I use it for, where I'm not necessarily just trying to get a ton of distance, but I want a really reliable shot. And similar to what I used to use the Thunderbird for on the backhand. What were you enjoying it for on those shots?
On the backhand, definitely putting it out flat on a hyzer. The one shot or two shots that I was finding the most success at this week was at playing Watson on both 6 and 7. And 6, you're really just trying to keep it flat and trying to get that predictable hyzer to shoot
let
in.
the disc do the work to get you to the hole.
I haven't birdied that hole. I mean, it's a very birdieable hole in the backhand. If you have a good backhand, very birdieable. I haven't birdied that hole in a while, and I birdied it twice in a row with the Onyx. I actually overdrove it about 15 feet, and I think
nice.
I had a 20-foot putt both times. So I was really liking it for that shot, and I was just putting out flat and letting the stability do the work. And then also on hole 6, the one after, I think is that about a 340-foot hole?
Yeah, I think it's probably a full 350, but it plays just slightly downhill.
Yeah.
So,
but that's another one you're kind of wanting to put it. If there's a tailwind, you're wanting to put a little bit out on a hyzer to let the tailwind kind of push it to the basket. It's one that you just put a little bit out on a baby hyzer out wide, and it just hope that you get that perfect skip going up. And the Onyx is honestly, like, that's now the disc that I'm thinking about on that shot. So
yeah, I think it definitely excels on that flat to hyzer or the hyzer in general. I think it's right at the edge of my arm speed, and so I actually typically like a little bit beat in Onyx. I have one that I've had in the bag for 2 years, and it's actually flippy at this point. I think that any of the flat Onyxes, they wear pretty quickly. Once again, I think it's that sharp, aggressive rim that probably has it. So I've got one in my bag that honestly has quite a bit of flip to it. That it's probably one of my most thrown discs when I have a long course and not a ton of wind, because it has a good bit of flip, but then it has that like really straight flight and then a reliable fade. And then like a slightly worn in Onyx I really like once again for that flat to hyzer and the headwind shots. It's a really good disc. It's pretty similar in terms of the slot for the Thunderbird to me. So I'm curious what you thought of it compared to the Thunderbird. I know you like the Thunderbird forehand primarily. Is that really like, how you think about the discs? Is one you like more forehand, one you like more backhand, or more than that?
That's definitely when I think about building my bag. I'm definitely thinking about forehanded versus backhand. And also, I mean, with my Wraith, I can use them both. I'm using it both with my forehand and backhand, except for my Halo race. They're primarily just forehand.
They're pretty stable unless you have a massive headwind for us.
So it is one, I think, in general, if it does go in my bag, it's one that I'm thinking more so with my backhand. I think, again, I would mess with it a little bit more with my forehand. But yeah, that's definitely where I'm going. And you're right. I mean, it is kind of in that Thunderbird range, maybe a little bit. It's hard for me because it's right in between that Thunderbird and Wraith. And to be honest with you, I'm not getting, with my Wraith, I'm probably getting about 350 to 360. With the Onyx, I was probably landing about 345, 340.
Yeah, there's not much distance difference.
So with the Wraith, I'm still getting a little bit more distance. And so if I was going for distance, I probably still would pick up my Wraith.
Sure.
So yeah, it's kind of, I love the disc. I'm kind of like trying to really figure out where I'm going to go going forward.
Yeah, well, we can get into the rating in a minute. I just wanted to talk about plastics. So you've just thrown a couple of the ESPs. I've thrown ESP and Big Z. The Big Z, the ones that I got at least, started out pretty stable, not like crazy overstable, but pretty stable. I've got one first run that's kind of Z ESP blend that I really like that I have in my bag, and then I've got an ESP that's been well worked in. But I personally just like the stock plastic. It feels great, and it's got good grip, and I kind of like that it wears in fairly quickly. It kind of lets you pretty easily start to have that layering concept we're talking about before, where you might have a fresh one that's going to be pretty overstable for you. You might have one that's pretty straight, and then you may have one that's but still like a really reliable fade. Then you may have one that, like for me, you eventually break it in that it's kind of that flip up hyzer disc. I do think that this is a disc I'd say I wouldn't give a beginner. I think that there's just better discs for them. I think that you combine that it does have some good glide. I think it's not crazy overstable. But once you get into that 9-10 speed stable disc, I do think that probably a player who's, going to use that as their Firebird equivalent, they could go with something else. But if you wanted to teach really good form, I'd probably say, no, you probably don't want to start with an Anax. What do you think, David?
Yeah, I'd be right there with you. I think in general right now that, I mean, you mentioned this is probably the top of your arm speed. I'd feel the same on backhand. It's probably, maybe even pushing it for me, but as far as stability goes, it's just something that I really enjoy and know that I can put it out on a predictable line and it's going to land where I want to. And that's why I tend to, especially in tournaments, lean towards overstable discs.
Yeah, and I think a beat in one would be much more approachable, but I do think that probably somebody who's adding it to kind of round out their bag rather than maybe one of their first drivers makes sense to me.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. Well, we can get into the rating. I'm curious what you're going to do with the Anax, but the rating system is 1 out of 5. We'll sum David and my score to 10. So 1 is this disc just isn't that great. 2 is it's a fine disc, but there's definitely better options out there. 3 is it's a good disc, but it doesn't stand out. 4 is it's not going in my bag, but it's fantastic. And 5 is, yeah, it's going in my bag. So David, what's your rating?
Dude, I'm going 4.5 here, man. I told
same rating as you gave the Thunderbird.
Yeah.
I sent some indecision.
Some indecision. I went out and bought one this past week because I did fall in love with throwing it. I really enjoyed being able to. I threw it both at elevation and I threw it in Arizona as well at sea level, and I really liked how it was coming out of my hand both places. And again, I said I kind of want to mess around with a little bit more with the forehand. Yeah, I'm a little undecided. I took one of my my more flippy Wraith out of my bag, and this is right now, I guess, my replacement for it, and trying to figure out, because I do have a lot of Wraiths in my bag, and trying to figure out if this is something that I want. I think it's definitely possible that I might keep it in there, but it's possible that I might not find myself going to it in the long run. So we'll see. I think it's a great disc. I hate making decisions. Josiah, you keep putting this on me of doing all these disc reviews. But yeah, I got to say, I enjoy it. I'm pretty indecisive right now. I definitely like the idea of having it in my bag, but I'm not quite fully committed to it yet.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair. And I think that, we may eventually have like a review archive, and we may have our initial review. And then as we start to get better or our concepts change, our bags change, we may, occasionally update that. So be looking for that sometime down the road. But, we're just kind of catching in this moment in time, what we're thinking of the discs in our bag and the discs that we're throwing. So that's totally reasonable. I'm going to give it a 5. I think that when I'm not throwing well, the Anax, for me, at least the more stable ones, I don't throw them as often because I usually will try to throw something a little slower, a little less stable as much as possible. But I love having a disc that I can really trust in the wind. And I love having a disc that breaks in to something a little bit more neutral and straighter, so you can layer them. They start out nice and stable, they break in, and then go from there like we talked about earlier. So I'll definitely give it a 5. Especially on placement shots, I love it. I think that flat to hyzer, it does super well on. I think it can handle an ante, but I don't love it forehand. I won't give it a 4.8 or anything weird like that. So I'll just give it a 5. It's a great disc, and Macbeth made a good one. And speaking of Macbeth, David got one of our Anaxes signed, or one of my Anaxes signed, one of your Anaxes signed, it could be, which we're going to give away this week. So you can just check out our Instagram page for that, and we can give away an Anax.
Thank you, Paul Macbeth.
Yeah, he has a good signature, and it's a pretty Anax. So be looking forward to that at the release of this episode or somewhere around there. Well, that's the majority of our episode, but David, just for fun, what's a dream disc golf course that you would go play a tournament at?
This is kind of an easy one for me, and we just got to see it last weekend. The Las Vegas Challenge, I think, is where I would want to go if I was going to be playing in a tournament that would fit my style play the most. If I felt like I'm not the best at playing wooded courses, because we don't have very many wooded courses here in the Grand Valley. So I think naturally that I gear towards that. And one hole that I really want to play is that par 4. I think it's the island hopping hole.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's only like a 290-foot hole or something.
Are you going to go flat top Firebird
Flat top Firebird
for the
Spike for the eagle? I just really want to be able to.
I think you could do it.
I know.
You have that shot where the disc, instead of skipping, like rolls over on its back. Yeah. I think you could do it if there's no wind.
So I'd be stoked. I feel like it's definitely probably the most gettable eagle for me at any course, and I'd like that.
Yeah.
How about you?
I hadn't, we talked about this question, but I hadn't thought of one immediately that came to mind. Maple Hill's up there for sure, and that may be the one I'd go with. I think it'd be fun to be up that direction. I'd be between that and the courses that they play at the GMC, or the Green Mountain Championship. But I'm going to go with Maple Hill. It's just classic, historic. It's wooded. I'd probably get beaten up, but I like those lines. I like those shots. I like the Christmas trees. And I think it'd just be fun to play that course that I love watching every year. There's a bunch of good ones out there, and I hope we get to travel more. I've played the Fort a few times that they had the Worlds at last year, and I love that course. Since I've played it before, I wouldn't put it on the list, but that's a super fun course to play. And we're gonna head out there in April, so we'll probably podcast right after playing the Fort, so we'll get David's thought on playing through a lot of trees.
Super pumped about that.
No, it's fun. Well, that wraps up the episode for us. Thank you to everyone who has supported the show, and thanks for leaving 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts. It helps people find the show. Zeke9999 wrote, "Great new disc golf podcast. This podcast fills kind of a unique niche among disc golf podcasts. Focus on players who are working on improving their games. Sort of like a casual conversation with your friends about disc golf and improving your game." Yeah, that's definitely where we're trying to be. We're not there yet, but we're working really hard on getting there, and it's fun to just get to talk to you, David, but also I think for us just to kind of have chances to just talk about how to get better and get pro tips and all that kind of sort of thing. So thanks, Zeke9999, for the review, and thank you guys for listening. And as always, whether it's coffee or disc golf, don't forget to enjoy the grind.